You've heard about the IMF and the World Bank. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank Group have gained a reputation for binding the global south to debt and neoliberal dictates from global north creditors. 80 years since their establishment, in the current context of global economic and climate crisis, the US-backed Zionist genocide in Palestine, expanding war in the region and in Africa, the IMF and the World Bank are claiming to reinvent themselves. Both have adopted strategies that claim to address gender inequality and the climate crisis. This makeover is not new. The IMF and the World Bank were created during the tail end of the Second World War, years after the Great Depression, to help out with post-war reconstruction and economic growth, and establish a new international economic order. U.S. Treasury Assistant Secretary Harry Dexter White and UK Treasury Advisor John Maynard Keynes led the conference in July 1944 in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in the United States.
At Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 allied and associate countries arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference.
At the time, the US had dominated the world economy, with control over two-thirds of the world's gold. The first international monetary system established that the value of currencies are pegged to the US dollar, which in turn was pegged to gold. For the following decades, in the IMF's own words, the IMF would be essentially a dollar-centric institution, with the US providing most of its lendable resources and effectively controlling most of its lending decisions. The US holds significant influence over the IMF and the World Bank through majority capital shares that determine their voting power. The US is the sole country that has de facto veto power within the IMF and the World Bank. Moreover, a gentleman's agreement between the US and Europe defined that leadership of the World Bank will always be held by a US citizen and the IMF by a European. Since the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference, the IMF and the World Bank have played major roles in the international financial architecture and world economy. Today, the IMF is known for lending to countries with problems in their balance of payments or the payment of foreign debt and imports. The World Bank Group has a development mandate. It provides loans to finance infrastructure projects as well as development policy loans, which come with conditionalities that require borrower countries to adopt structural and macroeconomic reforms. The World Bank has also been influential over land policies in the global south. Throughout history, the IMF and the bank have reinvented themselves to maintain their relevance. Following the oil and debt crisis in the 1970s that largely hit export-oriented global south economies, the IMF and the World Bank came up with structural adjustment loans in the 1980s to help countries with their balance of payments. Structural adjustment loans came with neoliberal policies such as austerity, privatization, liberalization, and deregulation. Austerity is the IMF's policy prescription to supposedly fix governments' budget deficits by cutting back on public spending and social services, subsidies, and employment, privatizing state enterprises, and increasing revenues by wringing taxes from wage earners. At the same time, austerity incentivizes corporations with tax cuts. Privatization of state-owned enterprises and public services, and liberalization and deregulation of domestic markets and industries prime countries for foreign capital investments in large-scale infrastructure and extractive projects. The World Bank provided the first structural adjustment loan of $200 million to Turkey in 1980. The loan aimed to promote greater reliance on market forces and less direct state intervention and control, increase export orientation, increase mobilization of domestic resources, and finance imports such as agricultural inputs and steel. Structural adjustment has made health, education, and other social services more inaccessible and costly, and worsened gender inequalities. States have shifted the responsibility to women and girls who are traditionally expected to take on unpaid and underpaid care work for their families and communities. The regulation and liberalization have shrunk local agriculture and industries. Farmers have lost livelihoods and incomes, wages have stagnated for decades, and workers' rights and protection have been reversed to give way to foreign corporations. Infrastructure and extractive projects have displaced farmers and indigenous peoples from their lands. Neoliberal policies have reduced the public duty of governments and made them promoters of foreign corporations and private capital. The IMF and the World Bank ceased to use the term structural adjustment when it became unpopular. But they continued to use loans with neoliberal conditionalities in the name of poverty reduction and growth, and today, climate, gender, and sustainability. The spread of neoliberalism came with an iron hand. The IMF and the World Bank are also known in the Global South for financing military dictatorships that have committed widespread human rights violations. The World Bank financed the Chaisay Dam built in Guatemala in 1982 under the dictatorship of General Efrain Rios Montt. The construction of the dam displaced Maya-Achi ethnic people and killed at least 5,000 people. The IMF began negotiations with Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet in October 1973, merely a month after the US-backed military coup on September 11, 1973, that killed the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende. Then IMF Director Johan Witteveen justified support on the principle of economic neutrality and said, the fund must deal with each member through its government and cannot allow itself to be influenced by the political orientation of the government of a member. The Pinochet dictatorship was in power from 1973 to 1990. During dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr.'s rule in the Philippines between 1965 to 1986, his administration received 14 loans from the IMF and 89 loans from the World Bank. Indigenous peoples' resistance against the World Bank-funded Chico River Dam project by the dictatorship was a landmark victory for indigenous people's struggle for ancestral land and self-determination. In January 2021, the IMF released $350 million emergency aid to Myanmar a few days before the takeover of the military junta. The aid was released despite opposition from civil society organizations who raised concerns that the resources might be exploited by the military junta. Parallel to the IMF and the World Bank's history is a history of people's resistance to debt bondage, neocolonial power, plunder, and exploitation. A history of people's struggles for rights, justice, and sovereignty. Social movements call on states to repudiate debt to free up resources for health, education, and other public services. They reject neoliberal dictates and assert people's sovereignty over development. They highlight the need to prioritize local agricultural production, the development of strategic industries, and the diversification of local economies to move away from dependence on loans and foreign investments. Their call to shut down the IMF and the World Bank is a daring birdsong to a possible future.